This is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today I'm here with Allison Baum of Fresco Capital. Allison, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, great. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing, and also about Fresco Capital and what they're all about?
Absolutely. Fresco is a global early stage venture fund. So our model is investing in companies at the seed stage and then growing with them over time and helping them figure out what is the right timing and strategy for expanding globally. And then we have teams internationally that they can work with closely to help kind of facilitate their international strategy, whether that means finding their first international customers, setting up an office, outsourcing certain parts of their operations, working with strategic investors, or even potential acquirers. So we kind of aim to embed a global aspect into our portfolio from the very early stage, and then actually help on the operational side.
And what is your background? What did you do that led you up into the venture capital world?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Fresco, we're a venture fund, but we're a startup too. So I actually started the fund with two partners when we were all living in Hong Kong. And we started the fund because we had experience as entrepreneurs ourselves, sort of launching businesses internationally, and saw how difficult that was, but also how big of an opportunity it was to build more kind of global companies from both an impact and capital sizing perspective. There's just so much more you can do when you're thinking globally. So we felt like a lot of early stage venture funds tend to be very local, and that's very important. But given our kind of unique network and experience, we had something a little bit different to bring to the table. So that's exactly what we did when we started the fund. But before that, I'm actually not very international myself at all. I was born and raised in Illinois and didn't grow up traveling or anything, but was always interested in what's happening around the world, and ended up going to Harvard for undergrad, and then joined Goldman Sachs right out of college and had a stint on Wall Street, and then kind of jumped into the entrepreneurial world by joining as an early member of the team at General Assembly, which is an education technology company, which is training corporate professionals in digital skills like digital marketing, user experience design, web development, kind of filling a gap in the job market. And so helped launch that company in New York, and then moved to Hong Kong to launch their business in Asia, which is how I met Steve and Titus, who are now my partners at Fresco.
So you had a pretty broad experience both within the startup world, outside the startup world, both within the U.S. and outside the U.S. Diversity is one of the biggest topics in the venture capital world today, and how fast it's moving. What's your take on diversity today, and are you seeing change happen out there beyond just the plethora of blogs that talk about it? Are things really moving forward?
That's a great question. My view is that humans are relatively rational, so we tend to behave in a way which is beneficial to us given our goals. And so I think there's a lot of conversation around diversity as sort of a moral issue of, we need to have equal opportunity and all of that, which of course I do believe, but I don't necessarily see those conversations leading to action. For us, we've ended up building a very diverse team because it's helped us accomplish our business goals. So we're a global fund. We're investing internationally, sourcing deals internationally, as well as launching companies internationally. And what we've found is that people like to work with people that look like them and that share their experience, and they have something in common, especially at the early stage where you're dealing with a very complicated reality of fast changing markets and businesses, et cetera. And so it's much easier to trust people that you share a common background with. So it's natural to do that. So if we want to be successful in these different markets, we really need to work closely with people that have experience in doing business in those areas as well. So we've ended up working with our Japanese team is kind of led by our Japanese venture partner, and our Chinese operations are led by our Chinese venture partner. And that has really allowed us to be more successful in these markets. So I think what needs to change about the conversation around diversity right now in the US is to move it from it being a kind of nice to have, and instead framing it as more of a critical need if you want to be successful kind of building your business.
So what do you think is going to change that in the U.S.? You work internationally, and so it forces you to work in a diverse environment. But for VCs that are U.S. only, and they've got their network and they have their thing to do, so to speak, What's going to force them to actually open up and expand into a more diverse culture?
I think you always have to go kind of one step up the food chain. And, I think actually institutional LPs really need to start kind of changing the way they think about the VCs that they fund and demanding more diversity in the managers that they're backing. And they have to be more willing to invest in emerging managers, because the reality is, if you are a minority in this market, you're starting out from a completely different sort of base. You're starting out new, and you can't necessarily come to the table. Like, the only people that can come to the table with years of a track record are ones who have experience in the industry in the way that it's been functioning. So in order to bring about change, I think institutional LPs need to take some risks and back some emerging diverse managers. And then that tends to trickle down into, you can see just by the function of the diversity of our GPs, myself, Stephen, and Titus, we end up investing in between 30 and 50% of our portfolio has at least one female co-founder. And that's not at all something that we intended to do. It just happened by default because I'm a woman and often connect and source deals from female founders. They feel we can relate to them, et cetera. And so I think when you kind of have to have diversity at all levels, and then it will naturally fall through. And then we have a lot of our founders come to us then and come to me and say, hey, you guys have a diverse team. What are some ways that I can ensure I have a diverse kind of hiring practice within my own company? And that's a natural conversation and not something that's necessarily being imposed. It's just what they're exposed to, and therefore what they're kind of predisposed to reflect.
So you're saying if the LPs want it, the VCs will do it. If the LPs don't want it, then the VCs may or may not do it. Is that right?
Yeah. And I don't think it necessarily has to be that proactive on LP's part necessarily, but more of, I think, funding different types of managers. It doesn't have to say, oh, we'll only invest in your fund if you have a female partner. I don't think that's necessarily highly likely, but I think when they are faced with managers like myself or emerging managers or people that are coming from kind of outside the system, they have to be willing to fund them.
Well, I've had VCs come to me and tell me they don't really believe in cryptocurrencies, but their LPs do. So therefore, they are now dealing with cryptocurrencies in whatever way it works for them. And so it does seem that the LP does exert a certain amount of influence because the money is flowing in that direction, and you have to deal with that. If the entrepreneurs come to you, maybe you deal with it, maybe you don't. When the LPs you must have a response in some way, it seems like. But do you see LPs getting more proactive in that direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they definitely are. The conversation, for as much as we can say that you were asking if the conversation in diversity is actually leading to any action in the US, I would say that in a lot of other kind of international markets, the diversity conversation is years and years behind. So I think it's good that we're talking about these things right now in the US. And it's good to see that there is some kind of motivating factors from the institutional side.
So on the international front, you're saying the market is much further advanced with diversity than in the US. Is that right?
No, it depends. I think that in certain international markets, like say Hong Kong or Singapore, there's a natural type of diversity that exists because of certain kind of socioeconomic factors, but also that most businesses that are out of those regional hubs tend to be global, because Hong Kong has 7 million people. Singapore is much smaller than that. And so you can't really build a big business by simply marketing to your local ecosystem. You have to be international. And so, like I said before about kind of how we've built our team, I think naturally there's a business need for diversity there. So in that sense, it can be much further down the line. But I think it is kind of a uniquely American conversation right now around how do we deal with and react to kind of these issues around diversity. Because it's really only recently in the US that it's become a significant business risk. If you look at Uber and some of these other VC funds, or Harvey Weinstein, having bad behavior due to a lack of diversity has created some serious business risks here. And so that's kind of what I believe is actually motivating people to change, as opposed to just sort of a desire to be nicer.
Well, there has to be something very real that will drive it forward, and LPs driving it forward, risk of lawsuits driving it forward. What else do you think might drive it forward?
That's a good question. I think just tying it all back to business. So I think reframing the conversation around business needs and diversity being the best business decision that you can possibly make. I think risk mitigation, so avoiding lawsuits, is smart. But also, I was talking to someone about this yesterday, that when you have a diverse sort of team, you're forced to crystallize and justify and rationalize some of your decisions in a way that you're not if everyone in your team is exactly the same. So it's basically a mechanism of avoiding groupthink. And so I think that could potentially move things forward. And also just having more diversity at the leadership level in politics, in the media, that will certainly move a lot of these conversations forward as well.
So you work in Asia quite a bit, and you work on the venture capital side. In addition to diversity, what else do you think is different between venture capital in Asia and venture capital in the U.S.?
There's definitely a different, and this is part of what we do and kind of we believe in sort of bridging the gap at Fresco, but there's certainly a different relationship, I think, between the capital and innovation. So we source investments globally. We have companies, founders that are based, everywhere from Southeast Asia to Europe to the US. So we're pretty agnostic about where we actually invest. But every company we invest in has to have global ambitions, and we believe has to be a potential billion-dollar opportunity. And so naturally, you see that the startup ecosystems in the US and then now a little bit Europe are becoming are naturally, more mature. And so you see a lot more potential billion-dollar companies and actual billion-dollar companies coming out of those ecosystems. And in Asia, kind of across the region, there's historically been a lot of capital available, but not necessarily that same culture of innovation, experimentation, building startups and scaling them. And so it's been interesting to watch how there was a lot of capital, but not that much innovation. I think that's starting to shift, and that's something that we're really committed to in a lot of our ecosystem development activities. We help to run hackathons and work with strategic investors and other VCs in the region to help kind of improve the startup ecosystem there. But I think that's definitely one of the biggest differences between the regions to start.
What about patent protection, and where are we with that overseas? And I always figured once they had their own patents, they would probably respect them a lot more than they have in the past. And where do you think that might go?
Yeah, patent protection is a really interesting space. We kind of deal with it a lot when we're helping our companies launch in new markets. I think the unfortunate reality is when it comes to IP, unless you're doing something extremely cutting edge, it tends to not really matter that much at the early stage. It's more about, can you actually turn this sort of innovation into a real business model? I think we tend to just sort of watch how that market is evolving, and there's a need for better, I think, more differentiated patent protection. But if you do business in places like China, the reality is it doesn't matter.
What about just the general laws and the regulatory? Do you find that to be a challenge in getting startups off the ground in Asia?
Yeah, absolutely. There are certain regions like Hong Kong and Singapore where it's much easier to start a company, much cheaper to start a company. In places like Japan, where I've been based for several years, it's a much kind of higher hurdle to jump over. And I believe that that's also correlated with the general culture of being an international founder and launching in that market. I mean, Japan is historically just very protective, and they have a very strong domestic market. There's a lot of high barriers to launching in Japan. You basically need to go there with a strategic partner, and you need to physically be there in order to have a successful launch. Versus there are other markets where it's like Hong Kong or Singapore, which are naturally more international, are very open to global companies coming in, and that is kind of embedded in the culture. So if you're a founder, it's also just naturally a lot easier culturally to launch there as well.
And how do the governments treat entrepreneurs with stock options and potentially large payouts? And I worked in Europe many years ago where these were very foreign concepts on the continent, and it was very difficult to pay people those things because the economy or the government that just didn't mesh with the rest of what they had going on there. How do you find that in Asia?
It's evolving. So I think part of the development of the ecosystems in the region is starting to see some real examples of founders that have done so well that this becomes an issue. There's different tax treatments and all of that. And I think there are different governments that are more proactive about supporting entrepreneurial ecosystems than others. Singapore has been very liberal with what kind of benefits they provide to entrepreneurs, but also angel investors, and kind of encouraging people to make investments in startups. And that has had both positive and negative implications for the startup ecosystem. I think when the government gets involved, it's good because it shows commitment, and then there's a lot more kind of activity and it's on top of people's minds. It's good to incentivize people. But at the same time, I think the government tends to be not very efficient in terms of picking and choosing where there's likely to be success or where it makes sense to lean in. And so in a place like Singapore, I think it has in some ways actually held the ecosystem back because there are a lot of startups that get funded that just shouldn't. They're not scalable businesses. They don't make sense. And you have founders who, in my opinion, end up wasting years of their lives on ideas that just are not viable.
That all sounds very good. In the few minutes we have remaining, what have we not covered about diversity and working in Asia that we should have?
It's a very deep topic. I think you could talk about it all day. There's a million directions to go. But kind of the idea that being a global business requires diversity in order to be successful is really core to our strategy and a narrative that I think we would love to spread.
Well, that's great. Well, I appreciate you taking time and sharing your thoughts today, and hope to have you come back and let's explore more of these topics, both diversity in Asia and future podcasts. But thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, great. Thank you for your time.